What if the person who gave everything for his family was pushed aside by the very people he loved most? This is the story of Anthony, a widower who believed loneliness was his final sentence, until one quiet act of courage from his grandson began to rewrite the ending. Anthony woke before the sun because his body didn't remember how not to. Years of construction sites had trained his bones to rise with the dark. 5:30, without fail. He sat at the edge of the bed and listened. The old ranch house in the cul-de-sac made the same small noises it always did. Pipes sighing, the fridge humming, a wind chime clinking 2 doors down. Everything familiar, everything empty. He reached for the lamp, then paused at the second switch. A habit from a lifetime of turning on 2 lights because there were once 2 people in the room. He left it off. The shadow in the space beside him said enough. In the kitchen, he ground beans by hand, the way he always had. The grinder's soft rasp, the kettle's thin whistle, the mug warming his palms, rituals that used to be shared. For 38 years he poured 2 cups. Now he measured for 1 and poured slowly, stretching out the small human ceremony as if time might be more generous if he treated it gently. He walked the house with his coffee. Picture frames lined the hallway. 3 kids with gap-toothed grins at birthday tables, Halloween costumes made of duct tape and stubbornness. A long-ago Christmas with a tree that leaned and a living room that sparkled anyway. He stopped at his favorite. His wife's head tipped back in laughter, flower on her cheek, his hand blurred mid-swipe, the moment right before he kissed it away. Grief didn't knock, it lived here too. The porch faced east. He settled into the porch chair that creaked on cue and watched a pale ribbon of light lift over the maple trees. The neighborhood had changed. Fewer station wagons, more SUVs, kids who scooted past without waving because people didn't wave much anymore. Some mornings a jogger lifted a hand. Most mornings Anthony nodded to no one. The backyard was his refuge. He stepped down onto cracked concrete that led to raised beds he'd built out of leftover cedar. Tomatoes strapped to stakes, marigolds lining the edges, a stubborn rosebush that refused to admit the soil wasn't ideal. He talked to the plants the way old men talk to radios. Low, companionable, unembarrassed. "You and me, Rosie," he told the rosebush. "We keep showing up." By afternoon, he tidied a workshop that rarely needed tidying, sharpened chisels that were already keen, wiped dust off a lathe he barely used. The motions filled the silence without erasing it. He could feel the day thinning toward evening, when the house grew larger and colder and the corners gathered shadows. Phone calls were rare and brief, sometimes a wrong number, sometimes a utility. On holidays, his children texted a photo from someone else's dining room, good smiles, a caption, a heart emoji. He responded with a thumbs up because he didn't know how to type, "I miss you," without sounding like a burden. At night, he lay on his back and watched the ceiling fan wobble. He tried not to count the years since laughter had lived in these rooms. He tried not to ask the question that lodged in his chest and refused to move. When did love turn into distance, and why had no one told him it was happening? He had earned his living with his hands. When people in town drove past the elementary school with the red brick facade, or the library with its wide steps and bronze railings, they were passing pieces of his life. Anthony could point to lintels he'd set, stairs he'd framed, roofs he'd shingled in August heat until the tar blurred. He still kept a union card in his wallet, though he hadn't clocked in for years. It was soft at the edges, like a photo handled too many times. Work had been simple, in a way people forget simplicity can be. Measure twice, cut once, keep your word. Show up sober and early, don't leave a mess. He had applied the same rules at home. Sometimes he feared he'd applied them too strictly. Children don't remember square corners, they remember soft voices. When his wife got sick, the house learned a new rhythm, the beep of machines, the whisper of rubber soles in the hall, the soft click of pill bottles lined like little soldiers on the counter. He slept in a chair for weeks because he was afraid to not hear her call his name. She didn't ask for much. She never had. On the last morning, she reached for his wrist and squeezed, as if to say, "Promise me you'll keep going." He nodded. It turned out to be the hardest promise he'd ever tried to keep. After the funeral, the casseroles came and went, and then the people did too. The kids visited at first, their grief raw and uncomplicated, their voices loud in the quiet kitchen as they washed plates and told him they'd be back next weekend. Next weekend stretched. Life pulled at them from other states, other obligations, other hurts that had nothing to do with him, and somehow everything. Calls grew shorter. One son stopped picking up. His daughter spoke efficiently, as if emotion were a billable hour. He tried to understand where he'd failed. He replayed years like a man rewinding a tape, little scenes catching on the spool, the time he refused to co-sign a loan, the time he missed a school play because a concrete truck was coming, the time he told a teenager to be home by 10 and meant it. None of that felt like abandonment. It felt like care said in the only language he knew. But maybe love that isn't translated becomes something else on the other end of the line. Mrs. Rose from next door knocked every few days with something warm wrapped in a towel. Zucchini bread, a pot of chicken soup. Extra, she always said, though he suspected she cooked with him in mind. They'd talk on the porch about the squirrels stealing tomatoes and the price of lumber. She didn't pry. Her kindness didn't make him feel small. Evenings were the worst. That was when memory sharpened. He would sit at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and start a letter he didn't know how to mail. "I'm still here," he'd write. "I built houses so you could sleep under a roof I trusted. I didn't know how to say I was scared." The pen would hover. He would fold the paper and tuck it into a cigar box in the bedroom closet with the others. On the front of the box, in his wife's looping hand from some other lifetime, a label read, "Save for later." He didn't know when later was. He only knew he kept saving. Peter was 12, old enough to notice when the grown-ups avoided eye contact, young enough to still ask questions they didn't want to answer. On a rainy Saturday, while his parents argued in the kitchen about bills and schedules, he slipped into their bedroom looking for a spare notebook. In the bottom drawer of his mother's dresser, he found something else. A photo album wrapped in tissue paper. The pages smelled of dust and cedar. Black and white prints curled at the edges, color snapshots from the 70s bleeding faintly into beige. Smiles froze in time. Children blowing out candles. Teenagers in awkward jackets, a woman holding a pie with both hands. And there, always there, was a man with rough features and proud eyes. Sometimes with his arm around the children, sometimes alone in the background, but always present, as if he belonged at the center of every memory. Peter frowned. He had never seen the man in person. At least, he didn't think so. "Who are you?" he whispered to the page, tracing the outline of the man's hand resting on his mother's shoulder when she was still a little girl. That night at dinner, curiosity overcame him. He held up a single faded picture he had smuggled into his pocket. "Hey, Mom, who's this guy?" The room froze. His father's fork clinked against the plate. His mother's eyes darted toward the picture, then away. "That's nobody you need to know about," she said flatly, and stabbed her green beans as if the conversation was over. Peter pressed. "But he's in, like, every photo. Was he—" "I said drop it," his father cut in, voice sharp. The table went silent. The boy swallowed his questions, but not his wonder. Something about the tension told him the man was no stranger. Family doesn't vanish from every story without reason. That night in bed, Peter stared at the ceiling, the photo tucked under his pillow like contraband. Other kids at school talked about grandparents, pops who fixed bikes, nanas who baked cookies, gramps who smelled like cigar smoke and hugs. Peter had none of that. Or maybe he did, and someone had hidden it. His chest tightened with the unfairness. The next afternoon, as rain pattered the windows, he crept across the lawn to the neighbor's house. Mrs. Rose, who everyone called Miss Rosie, was sweeping her porch. She knew things about everyone. When he held up the photograph and asked, "Do you know him?" her broom stilled. She leaned closer, her eyes softening. "Of course I know him, honey. That's your grandfather. He lives just down the street." The words cracked the air open like thunder. His grandfather. Not dead, not gone, just erased. Peter biked past the cul-de-sac 3 times before he dared to stop. Miss Rosie had pointed to the small house with the peeling paint and the overgrown hedge. His pulse rattled in his ears as he coasted to the curb, shoes scraping the pavement. The house wasn't what he'd expected. It wasn't haunted or ruined. It was ordinary, except for the garden, flowers in bloom even in early spring, colors spilling across the yard like someone had painted hope directly into the soil. He pushed the bike onto the lawn and walked up the narrow path. The screen door sagged on its hinges. He lifted his hand to knock, hesitated, then knocked anyway. 3 sharp taps. His heart felt like it would bolt down the street without him. Inside, footsteps shuffled slowly. The door opened. A man with silver hair and tired eyes blinked at him, surprise widening his features. He held the frame of the door as though steadying himself against a dream. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Peter swallowed hard, then held out the photograph. "Are you him?" Anthony's gaze dropped to the image. His throat tightened. It was a photo he remembered, taken after a birthday party, his daughter still sticky with frosting, his arm around her shoulders. He hadn't seen it in decades. He looked back at the boy. The nose, the eyes. Yes, recognition hit him like sunlight after storm clouds. You're Helena's boy," he whispered, naming Peter's mother with reverence. His voice cracked on the word, "You're my grandson." Peter shifted, unsure whether to step forward or bolt, but Anthony opened the door wider. "Come in, son, please." The house smelled faintly of coffee and cedar, like the album had. Peter sat stiffly on the sofa, glancing at the crocheted blankets, the stacks of Reader's Digest, the photos scattered everywhere, faces he recognized from albums, but not from life. Anthony watched him carefully, as though one wrong word might send the boy running. "You look just like her when she was 12, Anthony said softly. The same stubborn eyes. Peter's cheeks warmed. "They don't talk about you," he admitted. Anthony's chest ached. "I know." He folded his hands, rough and scarred, resting them on his knees. "But you're here. That means something." For a while they spoke in fragments. Peter asked about birthdays from long ago, about houses Anthony had built, about a woman in the photos he realized must have been his grandmother. Anthony answered slowly, painting stories like brushstrokes. Sawdust in his hair, laughter at the dinner table, the smell of apple pie cooling in the window. When the boy finally stood to leave, Anthony felt panic rise. "Thank you," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "Thank you for today. You gave me more than you know." Peter nodded, gripping the photo tightly. He didn't have the words, but his eyes said enough. As he biked away, Anthony sat back on the sofa, tears streaking the dust on his cheeks. The silence of the house didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. From that day on, Peter found excuses to wander down the block more often. Sometimes he said he was going to the corner store. Other times, he claimed he had extra homework at a friend's house. But his real destination was always the same. The little house with the peeling paint and the flourishing garden. Anthony began to expect him. He started brewing an extra cup of coffee, pouring milk into a glass, because he remembered that boys liked milk better. He left the gate unlatched, so Peter wouldn't have to hesitate at the fence. Each small adjustment felt like preparing the world for joy. The garden became their language. Anthony showed Peter how to plant marigolds in neat rows, how to pinch basil leaves without killing the stem, how to listen for the difference between soil that needed water and soil that didn't. The boy bent close, absorbing every detail, dirt under his nails and sun warming his back. For Anthony, it was as if the years fell away and he had a second chance to teach, to pass something on. "Plants are like people," Anthony told him one afternoon as they staked tomatoes. "If you care for them every day, they grow strong. If you ignore them, they wither, but with a little patience, they can surprise you." Peter paused, looking at him. He understood it wasn't only about the plants. It was about family, about second chances. The boy nodded solemnly and tied the knot tighter. When they grew tired, they sat on the porch steps, sipping lemonade Rosie had dropped off. The silence between them was comfortable. Sometimes Anthony told stories about building the town library, or about the dog his kids had begged for in the 80s. Peter laughed at the image of his mother as a barefoot tomboy running through the yard. The stories stitched him to a history he had never been given. As the sun dipped low, painting the garden gold, Peter asked quietly, "Why don't Mom and Dad come here?" Anthony's heart faltered. He stared at the roses, then said carefully, "Sometimes grown-ups hold on to hurt longer than they should. But hurt isn't the same as love. Don't ever confuse the two." The boy didn't press, but the weight of the answer lingered. He rode home in silence, wheels crunching gravel, mind racing faster than his bike. And here, dear listener, I'll pause to ask you, do you believe small gestures can change the course of a family? If this story is touching you, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe, or share your thoughts in the comments. It helps keep stories like this alive. One overcast afternoon, Anthony led Peter into the back bedroom. The boy had been peppering him with questions about the past, what his parents had been like as kids, why no one talked about those years. Anthony hesitated, then reached into the closet and pulled down a wooden cigar box, the lid worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside lay a neat stack of folded papers. The edges were yellowed, ink smudged where a hand had lingered too long. Anthony held the box as if it contained both treasure and shame. "These are letters," he said. "Letters I wrote after your grandmother died, to your mum, to your uncles. I never sent them." Peter's eyes widened. "Why not?" Anthony sighed. "Fear, I suppose. Fear they'd crumple them up. Fear they'd prove I'd already lost them for good." His voice cracked. "But I couldn't stop writing either. So I saved them here. For later." He handed one to Peter. The boy unfolded it carefully. The words wobbled across the page, not from lack of skill, but from trembling hands. "I'm sorry I wasn't softer. I'm sorry for every time I built walls instead of bridges. Please know you are loved, more than I ever managed to say out loud." Peter's throat tightened. He read line after line, the ink stained with watermarks that might have been tears. These weren't the words of a man who didn't care. They were the words of someone begging to be heard, even if only by paper. "Did Mom ever see these?" Peter asked. Anthony shook his head. "No. I told myself I'd deliver them when the time was right, but the right time never came." The boy folded the letter back, his hands shaking. He had imagined his grandfather as a stranger, a ghost no one wanted to name. Instead, here was a man who had written love over and over, even when no one answered. Something fierce flared inside him, anger at his parents, sorrow for Anthony, determination to carry this secret like a mission. He looked at his grandfather and said, "They need to know. They need to read these." Anthony's eyes watered. "Maybe, or maybe it's enough that you did." But Peter had already decided. The letters would not stay hidden in a box forever. Secrets don't stay quiet in small houses. A shirt that smelled faintly of cut grass and old coffee. Dirt under a boy's fingernails, even on school nights. Questions asked and not answered. The pattern was there, and eventually Peter's parents noticed. It broke at Sunday dinner. Roast chicken, green beans, the TV murmuring from the living room, like a neighbor who never went home. Peter's mother passed the rolls and said too casually, "Where have you been going after school?" Peter felt the letter in his backpack like a second spine. "Bike rides," he said. "Where?" his father pressed, not looking up from carving the chicken. The blade clicked against the plate. "To the end of the block," Peter said, then added, because he had promised himself he would not lie when the moment came, "and sometimes to the blue house with the garden." Silence wrapped the table. His mother's hands went still. His father set the knife down with care, as if the smallest force might shatter something already cracked. "That house is off limits," his father said quietly. "Why?" Peter asked. He wasn't rebellious by nature, just newly brave. "He's my grandfather." His mother flinched, as if the word itself were dangerous. "You don't know what that man—" "I know he wrote you," Peter blurted, heart thudding. He slid the folded copy of a letter from his backpack and placed it on the table. "I know he tried." His mother stared at the paper, as if it were a live wire. She didn't touch it. His father's jaw worked, anger and something harder to name brimming under the surface. "You don't understand our history," his father said. "You don't get to decide who is safe." Peter swallowed. "I understand that he's alone. I understand he loves you. We're your parents," his mother said, voice trembling now. "You'll do as we say." Peter met her eyes and, to his own surprise, didn't look away. "I will not leave him alone." The room seemed to tilt. His father pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping. "Go to your room," he said, not angry anymore, just exhausted. Upstairs, Peter sat on the floor and listened to the muffled rhythm of adult voices through the vent. He didn't catch every word, but he heard mistakes and forgiveness and not again. He lay back and stared at the ceiling. He didn't want to be the reason anyone hurt. But if hurting was the price of telling the truth, then maybe hurt was the beginning of healing, not the end. The next morning, his mother stood in the doorway with a laundry basket. "I can't talk about this yet," she said, eyes rimmed red. "But I need you to stop." Peter shook his head once. "I can't." Later, when he pedaled down the street, the air felt heavier, like riding into wind. He wasn't sure what this would cost him. He only knew the line had been drawn, and he had chosen his side. At the Blue House, Anthony watched him chain the bike to the fence and knew, before a word was spoken, that the boy had paid for this visit. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's sit on the porch." They did, two figures beneath a sagging awning, not saying much. Sometimes love is just the sound of breathing in the same quiet. The cough started as a nuisance. 2 sharp barks after mowing, a tightness in the chest on damp mornings. Anthony waved it off with the stubbornness of men who have outlived more than one pain. "Just the weather," he said, clearing his throat as if he could clear the calendar too. But small things accumulate. A missed step on the back stairs. A nap that stretched into evening. The kettle whistling longer because he'd forgotten he'd put it on. Peter noticed first, because love taught him to measure time in details. He watched the way Anthony's fingers trembled when he buttoned his flannel, how he paused at the top of the porch steps as if summoning permission from his lungs. One bright afternoon, they were watering the marigolds when the hose slipped from Anthony's hand. He braced himself on the planter, eyes shut, breath sawing. Peter dropped the hose and grabbed his elbow. "Sit," he said, trying to keep fear out of his voice. Anthony obeyed. Pride is loud until the body demands quiet. Miss Rosie, as if the air itself had called her, crossed the lawn with a glass jar. "Sip," she said, "and don't argue." She glanced at Peter over Anthony's shoulder and mouthed, "Doctor." "I'm fine," Anthony rasped, which convinced no one. That evening, Peter stood in his parents' doorway, smaller than his decision. "He needs a doctor," he said. "Please, I can't do this alone." His mother's face softened in a way he hadn't seen in years when she looked toward whatever memory the word doctor had summoned. His father rubbed a hand over his jaw and nodded once, slow. "I'll make some calls," he said. It wasn't permission, and it wasn't surrender. It was a step. The clinic appointment happened on a Wednesday. Miss Rosie drove because Anthony trusted her not to hover. Peter sat in the back seat with a grocery bag of pill bottles and a list he'd written in block letters. Cough, dizzy, tired, night's worse. In the waiting room, Anthony stared at a poster about heart health and thought about all the ways a heart can fail that have nothing to do with arteries. The doctor listened, tapped, ordered tests, spoke in phrases that were careful not to scare. Inflammation, we'll monitor, change this med, follow up. It was not a catastrophe. It was not nothing. It was a clock you could finally hear ticking, Back at the house, Anthony napped in his chair, a fleece blanket over his knees. Peter sat at the table with Miss Rosie, the cigar box open between them. She ran a thumb along the top letters fold and said, "You were right to come to us, kid. Courage doesn't mean you aren't scared. It means you act anyway." Peter nodded, eyes on his grandfather's sleeping face. "I don't know how to fix this." "You're already fixing things," she said. "You're here." When Anthony woke, dusk had turned the garden blue. He cleared his throat and looked embarrassed to find the blanket on him. "I wasn't planning on sleeping," he muttered. "Good plans change," Miss Rosie said, gathering teacups. "So do families." Peter helped Anthony to the porch. The air smelled like wet earth and tomato vines, clean and honest. "I've been thinking," Peter said, voice steady. "Mum's birthday is next week." Anthony turned, wary. "Son, I know," Peter said. "But sometimes people need to hear words out loud, not in boxes, not in later." He looked toward the road where the streetlight flickered to life. "I think it's time." Anthony stared at the garden, at the rose they'd planted together, at the stubborn rose bush that kept blooming in imperfect soil. He exhaled, slow. "All right," he said, as much to himself as to the boy. "Let's see what grows when you risk the weather." The porch light clicked on. Night gathered. Somewhere inside, a clock kept faithful time. And in the space between one breath and the next, decision took root. The birthday party was loud enough to muffle nerves until the front door opened. Laughter dulled. Forks paused mid-air. Anthony stepped inside, leaning on his cane, his back straighter than it had been in years. Beside him, Peter clutched a folded letter, like a torch in the dark. The room bent around the silence. Relatives shifted, whispers cut short. His mother's face blanched, his father's jaw tightened, an uncle muttered under his breath. Nobody moved to welcome the man who had built half their childhood homes. "I brought him," Peter said, voice shaking but strong, "because you all need to hear this." Anthony wanted to protect the boy from their stares, but Peter pressed the paper into his hands. "Read it, Grandpa." With trembling fingers, Anthony unfolded the letter he had written years earlier, ink faded, creases worn deep. His voice wavered at first, then grew steady. "I'm sorry I wasn't softer. I'm sorry I built walls instead of bridges. Please know you were and are loved, more than I ever said aloud." The words filled the living room, pressing into corners, settling heavy in chests. Some relatives avoided his eyes, others wept quietly. Anthony saw his daughter's hands clench against her dress, saw his son's lips part and close again. He read to the end, his throat tight, and folded the page as if tucking it back into his heart. Silence lingered, broken only by Peter stepping forward and wrapping his arms around his grandfather's waist. The boy's small body anchored the old man in the storm. "You can all turn away," Peter said, looking at his parents, "but I won't." The declaration pierced the room. For a moment, Anthony feared it had been a mistake, that they would all rise, furious, and shove him out again. But then his daughter's tears fell fast and hot, streaking her face. She took one step forward, faltered, then whispered, "Dad." The dam didn't break. Not yet, but a crack appeared, and sometimes a crack is the beginning of a flood. The days after the party were quieter, but no less profound. The air in the family seemed charged, every word and silence carrying weight. Peter's mother was the first to come. She arrived at Anthony's house one morning with a paper bag of groceries, bread, milk, soup cans, and stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I can't stay long," she murmured, but she did. She sat for half an hour, sipping coffee, her eyes sweeping over photos she hadn't seen in years. She left quickly, but when the door closed, Anthony whispered thank you to no one in particular. A week later, his son drove by. He didn't knock, didn't step inside, but left a basket of firewood stacked neatly by the porch. Anthony touched the rough bark with calloused fingers and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with flame. The garden became the measure of their return. Marigolds brightened, basil spread, the stubborn rosebush bloomed twice. Peter and Anthony worked side by side, repainting planters, mending the fence, laughing at squirrels that refused to be outsmarted. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It breathed again. "Families are like gardens," Anthony told Peter, wiping sweat from his brow. "They take work every day. They take forgiveness, but they can bloom again." Peter nodded. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. He had carried it into his home, his parents' stares heavy as stone, and yet something had shifted. Love, once spoken, couldn't be unsaid. Neighbors noticed too. Miss Rosie stopped by with pie, and when she saw Anthony and his daughter talking on the porch, she smiled as if witnessing a sunrise. "Told you," she whispered to Peter. "Good soil grows back." By the end of summer, the family wasn't whole. Not yet. But there were phone calls that lasted more than a minute. There were visits that didn't end in slammed doors. And there were hugs, hesitant at first, then firmer, as if the body remembered what the heart had tried to forget. One evening, as fireflies blinked across the yard, Anthony sat on the porch swing with Peter. "You gave me back my family," he said. "That's more than I thought life had left to give." Peter leaned against him, the warmth of his small shoulder steady against Anthony's side. "You gave me one too," he answered softly. "I didn't know what I was missing until I found you." And here is where we leave them. An old man, once abandoned, now reborn in the laughter of a boy. A family fractured, learning to stitch itself back together. Because sometimes it only takes one act of courage, one seed planted in stubborn soil, to remind us that even what has been forgotten can bloom again. So if this story touched your heart, I invite you. Share it, leave your thoughts, and subscribe. Together, we can keep stories like this alive and remind the world that no one is ever too far gone for love to find them again.